This episode is brought to you with support from PerfectDailyGrind.com. Perfect Daily Grind, your source for coffee education, articles, videos, and more, from the farm to the cup.
Support comes from SF Bay Coffee, who pays farmers sustainable prices and helps build homes, schools, and medical facilities for their communities. Learn more at their website and get 10% off with the code COFFEEPODCAST at sfbaycoffee.com. Last episode on the Coffee Podcast.
If we look at the history of coffee, we see a little bit about how we got to this crisis and what the underlying problems in the market are.
Understanding the current coffee price crisis requires understanding the context of the problem. We started down that road in part one of our conversation with Professor Morris and touched on historical moments like the introduction of cheap land and cheap labor in a colonial environment, price being built around the average American pocketbook, and the development of the International Coffee Agreement. This time, we walk from past to present, and Professor Morris takes on discussing potential solutions based on the trends we have seen historically.
The problem is, how do you allocate quotas? We've talked about there being, historically high production in certain countries, so Brazil, Colombia. But we've got newly growing countries producing more coffee. So how are they going to split the quota? And that leaves a whole set of negotiations between countries about how to do that. Much of that is based on that they sort of say, well, there's how much you grow and there's historically how much of a market share you've had. Well, that obviously is a real issue, because in effect it usually ends up securing that the existing countries have a stronger power.
Exactly. That makes total sense. Yeah. It's kind of a written in issue.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, this is to give you a sense. So I mean, Brazil had 346 out of the 1,000 producer votes. So Brazil is a really dominant thing. So if you put Brazil and Colombia together, and they kind of follow the same path, then it's pretty difficult not to end up with what they want.
Yeah, makes sense.
I'm not Brazil and Colombia here. I'm just trying to explain the system. Yeah, countries who are trying to expand production therefore found that very difficult. How did they fit in? The way that they tended to work was to set target prices for various forms of coffee. So those four forms that we kind of know very famously, sort of Colombian milds, what's so-called other milds, Brazilian naturals, and Robusta. Those are the four big categories that are used. And the idea is, well, we manage the supply and demand to try and achieve a kind of a price band. If the price looks like it's falling below that band, we tighten the quotas, restrict the supply. If the price is above those bands, then we can relax the quotas a bit and increase the supply. Now, right in the middle of the history of the ICA, we see one of those fundamental catastrophic events that completely blows these systems away, and that's the 75 Brazilian frost. So basically, at this point, from 75 onwards, quite a long time, there's no need to control the price from the perspective of the producers, because the devastation that's been caused in Brazil is such that there isn't the supply. So, famously, the price shot up. I think it trebled, didn't it, almost overnight. So shot up the other side of $3 a pound. But what I'm trying to say is, okay, first of all, there's an issue for incoming countries. How do we get sufficient quota? Then there's another issue that I think we need to consider, particularly in the context of the current crisis and the ways that we think about the crisis. We've been talking about prices and countries, but those are the prices that go to the marketing boards or the government agencies that are exporting the coffee. Yeah? Now, how much of that price do they pay back to the farmer?
Big question mark. Yeah.
Big question mark. Varies a lot, varies over time a lot, is used as a whole nother management tool. Yeah. I said to you at the top of our conversation, I'd just been to Uganda. And Uganda is fascinating because it's a quality Robusta producer. It used to give about 70% of the export price back to the farmers, and it probably does again now. But in the period when the Amin regime was in power, Idi Amin, probably gave less than 20%. So at that point, the price that's on the international market kind of doesn't really matter. Do you see what I mean? I mean,
I
it's
do.
actually what's returning. So there's a
I do.
real problem there. And that problem is further complicated when we come to the issue of specialty. Because, and I'm sure others of your guests will be able to expound on this more, but in effect, under the ICA, most coffee is traded by class and it's pretty much homogenized. And if you're the government, you usually think about homogenizing because it's the easiest way of pricing and getting rid of all of your coffee. So that linkage between a particularly special origin or particularly high quality coffee and the ability to get that direct didn't really exist under the ICA. It was one of the reasons that was so difficult. The ICA doesn't also work that well as a model by which specialty can function. Now, that isn't probably the primary reason that it falls, but it is something that I think we need to remember when we start thinking about how do we fix this. The falling apart of the ICA, I think we probably know that actually, and again, this is perhaps an element that's rather interesting. The ICA is very much a manifestation of the Cold War. So it's perceived as being in the West's, particularly America's interest, to make the ICA work for Latin American countries to, as it were, avoid the contamination of communism spreading in Latin America. And by the way, and this is just an aside, the equivalent cocoa organization, which is the ICCO, is very much tokenized by the Soviet bloc. It's true. Anyway, come the end of the Cold War, or come the end of the Cold War as we usually recognize it, the sort of the fall of the Berlin Wall, the sort of the demise of the Soviet Union, so too we see the fall apart of the ICA. The American advisors don't want to continue it, particularly under Reagan and Bush. Some of the participating countries no longer see the value of it because it's too difficult to operate. There are too many people scamming. They're scamming, and again, be careful with my language, but you have a problem that there's the official market and then there are many unofficial markets. So there are these famous phenomena called tourist coffee, whereby a bunch of coffee is sold by a producer to a country that is not part of the ICA. This would often be Eastern Europe or Soviet bloc. And that coffee then trades itself back in to somewhere like the US and therefore is considered to have gone outside the ICA and therefore being produced outside the quota, but ultimately ends up in the market.
Interesting. Okay.
So
an accounting nightmare.
Yeah, an accounting nightmare, and something that increasingly undermines it. And then, of course, we have the other issue, which is there's a country which explodes in the 90s, which is just after the demise of the ICA, and that is, of course, the enormous growth of Vietnam,
right,
which is not a member of the ICA at that point. So that system basically falls. From the moment it falls in 1989, the price falls quite dramatically until the mid-90s. And then we have the same thing that I was coming back to about catastrophic things producing price corrections. There's a fairly big frost damage in 94 in Brazil, and that sort of stabilizes the prices until the end of the 20th century, when we hit the famous coffee crisis, if you like. Many of us are familiar with, and that we fear again that we're seeing similar prices to now. So that's that's the one that really, once again, I think we could say clearly that has influence coming out of the fact that Vietnam expands production so rapidly, that therefore coffee, the commodity coffee market sees a huge amount of coffee on it, that many buyers will go at the bottom end of the market, will go into Vietnamese Robusta. And we reach this point in which, well, basically, I often like to use what they call the ICO composite price indicator, because that sort of averages the prices across the various bands of coffee. So to give you a sense of that, in 1998, the ICO composite price was 109 cents per pound, so $1.09. 2002, it's 48 cents.
Wow.
48 cents. I mean, that's just, nobody can survive at 48 cents.
No.
Yeah. And again, the reasons are not difficult to see. I'll give you the figures here. I'm talking about excessive supply. So 2001, 2002, you've got 113 million bags of coffee being produced in that coffee year against a demand of 106. Okay, doesn't sound so bad. What makes it really bad? There are 40 million bags in reserve already. Yeah, this
okay.
stops. Do you see what I mean? So
I do.
we've had this excessive oversupply. So actually, what you're talking about is 155 million chasing a demand of 106 million.
I see. Mm-hmm.
So that's the heart of the problem. And as I say, the heart of that comes from Vietnam. It comes also to some extent from sort of much more technified coffee production in Brazil and some elements in Central America. And we know that at that point, crisis is that we saw the people who were pulling out of coffee, the uprooting of the coffee trees, which of course is if you pull out of coffee, you can't get back into it very quickly. You've got to grow the tree. It's not going to become viable for some years. It's a time when the acreage of coffee eventually, in a sense, the acreage adjusts because so many people go out.
To something else, yeah.
Yeah, and really, in truth, the correction on that, the ultimate, as I say, catastrophe correction, is coffee rust, because that spread of coffee rust actually reduces supply significantly in the 2010s, and that kind of balances the market. And now we've come out of the coffee rust, we're back in the oversupply. So I'm afraid to say, that sounds all rather, I've given you kind of a long history of up and downs, but the bottom line issue is supply and demand. And how do we make those two things equilibrate?
That's the big question.
That is the big question. And here is my suggestion of the start of an answer.
All right.
Throughout the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st, all the schemes I've described to you focus on controlling supply. If you think about it, all of those schemes have really been about managing supply. We need to do more about demand.
Consumer-focused marketing?
But now, consumer-focused marketing, but actually what we really need to do, and we have, as I'll go on to say some positives here, we need to grow demand. Now, growing demand is not something that is going to work on its own in traditional consumer countries, where there's only so much that we will drink. What we have seen, of course, in the specialty era is a change in the complexion of that demand, both in terms of, number one, the demand itself and what it's for, but also just the result of that has been the whole concept of coffee as a commodity product shifting towards a premium product. So if we think about what we've seen, and this is, something I think that people outside the industry find, is the big striking thing, the massive spread of the coffee shops, the whole way that coffee has become a whole lifestyle good. There's a whole subculture around coffee. People assume that this means that we've upped the demand. Well, not massively, actually. There's a bit of growth. I mean, it's interesting, North America has increased its consumption, but what we have done is change the way the world thinks about coffee. And that's beginning to have a real knock-on effect in new markets where you haven't seen coffee growing, coffee consumption previously. So the most obvious one is Asia, where we've seen very high rates of compound growth. So Asia is the most rapidly expanding market, much higher than anywhere else. And indeed, the overall volume of bags consumed now in Asia and Oceania is actually higher than North America as an overall market. Yeah, and of course, as a per capita consumption, it's much lower. And you'd have to say therein lies the opportunity.
I see.
Because by pushing that up, then, and by encouraging that, and as I say, we have already started that by making coffee such a lifestyle thing, that could change our balance. The other thing that changes our balance is that producer countries themselves, for a long time, would virtually consume no coffee with a few exceptions. So many countries indeed even refuse to allow their own coffee to be consumed in their own countries.
Colombia is one of those, yeah? Or...
Colombia was one of those, and Colombia did it also particularly by grade. Africa, many African countries would have been the same. You know that the coffee had to go to the marketing boards, and indeed you had the irony then of the shipping in of instant solubles back into these countries, but no chance to actually roast or taste their own coffee. Now, that's still in some countries. In others, it's changing rapidly. Colombia is one. Brazil has become the second biggest consumer market for coffee in the world, which is fantastic. So there are chances there to really grow new forms of consumption that would probably have two effects. I mean, one of growing the overall consumption against supply, and the other of offering a route to particularly producers in producing countries that if they actually have a direct consumer market, they don't necessarily have to go out onto the world market. That removes quite a few additional costs, if you like.
Right. And it could even potentially drive premium prices if it's just cheaper to sell it in your country.
Yeah, and I mean, you can avoid all kinds of things there because you can avoid exchange rates, for example.
Yeah.
So, again, I suspect in your series, people will talk a lot more profoundly than I will about exchange rates. But I mean, again, a crucial element of this is, well, what is the dollar worth against the Brazilian real or whatever? Because in a sense, okay, if my dollar price falls, but the power of the dollar against the real rises, then am I, as a coffee exporter, losing? Probably not, so there's a whole nother game to be played there once you get into speculation and so forth. But, that game goes both ways.
Right.
And this potentially offers an alternative route to market that, can look in a different way, that can be structured in a different way. Historically, I think what we can do, therefore, is we can identify a big fundamentals problem. We can identify the ways in which that has so far been addressed and the problems that creates in itself. We can see some issues about, well, we can't just go back to the past because there are also problems with the past, so we can't just bring back the ICA. We have to, adjust whatever we do to fit into that. But we can also see maybe a little bit of hope. Maybe. Then that's why I'm not the most pessimistic.
Which I appreciate.
And we can, yeah. And I mean, we can also say, if we want to go a little bit further, we can also say that there are some lines of hope that perhaps people don't think about as hope. So when we talk about people in Colombia or in India, to some extent, much less so, I'd say, in Africa, leaving coffee, we talk about the age of coffee farmers and that they're so old. But one of the reasons for that is because there are actually better opportunities in cities now and better opportunities in the overall economy. That actually isn't necessarily a bad thing. That's another way that, for example, consumption grows. Bigger cities, coffee is very much an urban drink. So, there will also be controls which are in effect as people find other outlets of economic activity that is more rewarding. So that has a double bonus effect because not only do they themselves improve their life, but actually that reduces the amount of coffee production. So there are many, many elements feeding in here. I do think there is some possibilities through that for those things of overall changing the fundamentals. And while I'm going to leave it to other people in your series to talk about the immediate structures and what we can do about C and how we do trading and so forth, I do think taking a historical view of those overall fundamentals is important.
Couldn't agree more. Well, thanks, Professor, for going through, like you called it, was a long history of the price of coffee. It's really helpful to get the big picture, and then to zoom in and to look at our current issue. I guess my final question to you is sort of an application question for our listeners. As people who care about this, I assume people listening care about this issue. What is it that we can do as listeners of this podcast to do something positive for this crisis?
Yeah, that is the sort of the difficult question, and in the sense that lots of little actions obviously can create change, but it is very difficult to identify that for ourselves. So I think that I'm going to stand aside as a historian and talk as a consumer at this point.
Okay.
I think what we can do is look for. It's actually do a combination of things. It's in one sense we can be quite hedonistic about this. We look for good coffee, and we enjoy good coffee, and we pay for good coffee. Yeah. Now, how do we pay for it as consumers? Because we're not the guys who fix the price. Not even we only know that what we pay for it. And I'm not suggesting that we all go out and pay the $50 a cup or whatever, because that's not necessarily even going back. But what we can do is look at what are companies telling us about what they're doing with their revenue pricing. How transparent are they about that?
Okay.
We can ask those questions, I think, as the kind of people who listen to your podcast, those of us who are in some sense sort of coffee connoisseurs who appreciate good coffee, those of your listeners, and I know many of your listeners are in the business of making sure that what they put out to their consumers is kind of in some ways, they know that ethically what was traced back. And again, I would imagine, I know there are schemes now where you can see the price of the coffee at each point all the way back to the farm gate.
You talking about blockchain there, Professor?
No, well, blockchain will achieve that for you, but actually I know that there are guys who will already put on their websites, okay, we're charging this, we paid this, the exporter paid this, the farm gate price was that,
Excellent.
And check that through. The big picture historically, what we do about growing consumption is much bigger. And that is about promoting coffee and its benefits in the many ways that we can. So, yeah, those are my thoughts, Jesse. And I'm going to be interested to hear other people try and answer that moral dilemma question.
Well, I appreciate your time on the show, Professor. And as always, we love to have your perspective and to add all this value as we seek answers to the big, hard questions in the industry today.
Okay, thanks very much, Jesse. I'm looking forward to hearing the rest of this series.
This is just the beginning of our conversation on perspectives of the coffee price crisis. Join us on the next episode as we discuss an unexpected topic surrounding the current crisis. You can find a discount on Jonathan Morris's book, Coffee, A Global History, on our website at thecoffeepodcast.org or in our newsletter. Sign up for our newsletter through our website or through Instagram bio. Please be sure to thank Professor Morris for his contribution to this series on social media, or if you ever get the pleasure to meet him in person at the next big coffee event. If you want to reach out, contact me at info@thecoffeepodcast.org. I want to give a shout out to our listeners out in Kenya. Thank you for listening. Music is by Michael Parallax. I'm Jesse Hartman. Thanks for tuning in. And as always, and until next time, happy brewing.